Alright, guys. Again, no face cam this time, just so I can sort of focus on not having this fade to black and lose all my data, at least in terms of the length of the video that I want to make. Okay, so last time, it seems as though that the narrative that of the last few pages was stuff that I've read in Imbecile, where basically it's like you, um, the poverty that you come with that gets blurred with the person that you are, and disease, sickness, genes, race, these all get overlapped for some reason with each other by bigoted opinions. And hold on. Yeah, so these all overlap because of confusion and maliciousness, bigoted like it's not all like nefarious, but at the end of the day, um, as certain diseases started to be less prevalent. No, I'm not saying there weren't any diseases around, but the book mentions that as diseases dropped and sickness went away and people were mostly healthy for the most part, and typhus was being defeated in the lice, they still ramped up their procedures and wouldn't and actually made it more extreme. So the so I don't know. I guess it's sort of like how you could perceive crime to decline in America and in democracies specifically, but at least in America, as crime has declined, you have prison systems, private prison systems, just locking people up for any stupid thing. And, you know, as we have suggested, it could be a fertility decline plan uh, to stop certain demographics from procreating in our society, but in a way that looks and could be politically debated on without it optically having to do with the person's skin color. Like, because, somebody steals a candy bar, well, some people are going to debate, does that person deserve to go to jail? And and if somebody, like, carjacked a car, does that person go to jail? Obviously, but for how long? And, obviously the biases are thrown in and justified to keep someone in for like an offense like weed. It's ridiculous. Anyways, I'm getting way off course here. Alright. Such graphic associations were also staples of the eugenic and nativist vocabulary of Laughlin, who, during the 1920s, authored studies asserting that the country's, quote, melting pot was being contaminated by bad germplasm. As he became increasingly preoccupied with definitions of whiteness predicated on family lineage and Mendelian fractions in the late 1920s, Laughlin offered to undertake a trip to the board on behalf of the so-called Citizen Committee, which had been formed by Box in the wake of rising Mexican immigration. Laughlin requested money from the Carnegie Institution, which was then financing the Eugenic Record Office, to travel to Texas to, quote, find out the relative amount of race crossing between American men and the Mexican women and between Mexican men and American women, end quote. During the course of his investigation, Laughlin obtained two confidential questionnaires that had been sent to Box. Both respondents were El Pasoans, and one identified himself as a physician with a local practice of 30 years. Furnishing in-depth answers to all the questions, this informant responded to the query, quote, "What contagious disease have they?" by stating, quote, "Tuberculosis mainly. The smallpox is constantly bobbing up here along with the border, and a constant fight by health authorities is the result. We have had typhus fever on more than one occasion, brought directly from Mexico. They bring disease into American families, but Americans must use them because there are no others, and besides, the work they work cheap. Ah, that's pretty mask off. Okay, the quote Mexican situation end quote has been a problem for the El Paso County Medical Society for years. Instead of solving the matter, we are getting worse end quote. Laughlin interwove these claims about the disease nature of Mexicans with warnings about the low scores obtained by Mexican schoolchildren on intelligence tests to press for Mexican exclusion. His proposals and ruminations served as fodder for the bills proposed by Box throughout the 1920s to restrict immigration from the Western Hemisphere to a 2 to 3% quota. Although these attempts did not succeed, Goeth, Laughlin, Box, and other eugenists did manage to formulate an alternative solution to the quote Mexican problem end quote, the U.S. Border Patrol. Oh my. I can see how this is definitely ramping up beyond just like a quarantine issue. Okay, the quarantine had other important consequences, although ostensibly the provisional measure instituted to combat a temporary health crisis. It became the status quo on the border, lasting until World War II. It contributed to the culture of segregation, suspicion, and violence that took shape in the Southwest and California during the first half of the 20th century. In the popular memory of El Paso residents, the experience of the border as a strict and forbidding line dividing Mexico from the United States was connected intimately to the implementation of the quarantine and the bodily assault of disinfection and the medical exam. Although the voice of the quote, auburn haired Amazon, end quote, Camelita Torres, who led the quote bath riots, is irretrievable. In oral histories conducted by the University of Texas at El Paso, border residents identified disinfection as a moment of bodily discretion. For example, one Mexican woman remembered her husband's accounts of the quarantine, told an interviewer, quote, the only thing they did in the immigration building was bathe them, the immigrants. They bathed them and took off their clothes, which were washed somewhere else and returned all wrinkled, end quote. All this, as Sonora X recalled, who was because, quote, they thought Mexicans were bringing microbes or something that like that over from Mexico, end quote. For Jose Barciaga, who came to El Paso in 1907 and crossed frequently, the quarantine transformed the bridge into an obstacle and the boundary line into the construct verified and enacted upon the body itself, noting that the disinfection plant was located right next to the bridge. Burciaga told his interviewer, quote, you see, when someone entered, they deloused him with something. What a nightmare. And then there were more. Men, women, they shaved everyone. They bathed everyone. And after the bath, they doused with chirolite, sodium aluminum fluoride. Okay. Um, comprised of some sort of substance. It was strong. End quote. Felix Lopez Aldialez, who resided in Juarez, stopped crossing into the United States in the 1920s in part because of his distaste for the quarantine. He recalled that the plant, which included some baths, some showers, and a boiler, end quote, was underneath the bridge. Remarking that his steamed clothing was always returned wrinkled, Lopez remembered that habitual crossers were required to undergo disinfection every week in order to renew their quarantine cards, and that at that workplace, this weekly requirement would cost them a half day's pay. So I'm going to speculate. I don't think this chapter mentions this as a type of conspiracy, but I feel like they could have ironed out the clothes, um, but they want the people to look disheveled potentially and look otherized, or so they look different so they can be otherized. And so, people will judge you based on your wrinkly fucking clothes. You know they will. Like, people are very snooty. So, I can see that being an attempt um, to have them be labeled differently as they're coming into America. Even if some of these people are well known. Um, anyways, for some Mexican immigrants who ventured outside the Southwest in search of opportunity, the quarantine framed their migration stories. This is aptly captured by a fictionalized account of the journey of Jose, one of the many informants interviewed by the prominent group of sociologists who launched a survey of race relations in 1925. Jose began a tale of his passage from Mexico to Pennsylvania with his arrival uh, at the Santa Fe Street Bridge. After he crossed the bridge, the immigration officers, quote, led me to the disinfecting plant. It did me no good to tell. It good me. It did me no good to tell. Took shape. Wait, what? That can't be right. Oh, to tell. Sorry, I didn't realize I took a double of that. Them that I had taken a bath few minutes before in Jerez. I had to take a bath anyway, and meanwhile they took my clothing to disinfect. I made a bundle and tied it with my belt. Then they put it in the oven, very hot. From there, hold on. From there it came out ready to put on again, except that my belt, being of leather, was wrinkled by the heat. End quote. After being photographed, Jose and other Mexicans in the line were vaccinated and then marched to the medical inspector who looked, quote, at our eyes and fingernails and head, end quote. For many Mexicans who entered the United States at official stations, the quarantine was an unforgettable passage into the strict racial order of the United States. Moreover, the preceding oral histories and statistics from the INS suggest that the severity of the disinfection procedure encouraged many to avoid designated points of entry. By the early 1920s, instead of undergoing baths, sterilization, and fumigation at El Paso Santa Fe Street Bridge, or Laredo's International Footbridge, many border crossers opted to head for isolated spots along the river or desert. It is quite telling that one of the immediate precursors to the Border Patrol was a unit created by the USPHS called the Mounted Quarantine Guard. Formed in Laredo in 1921, this guard was in charge of monitoring 150-mile-long stretches of the Rio Grande for, quote, illegals, vaccinating immigrants for smallpox if they lacked signs of scarification, and bringing seemingly dirty and sick Mexican immigrants to quarantine plants for kerosene baths. According to one official, these guards were instructed, quote, in quarantine work and in fact have done work at the station in order to gain this knowledge. That is, how to vaccinate, how to examine for vermin, for ringworm of the nails, trachoma, etc. In other words, how to give a general quarantine examination, end quote. The journal entries written by two mounted quarantine guards stationed in Laredo in 1921 detail this dual mission of surveillance and disinfection. On August 22nd, 1921, for example, Alvis C. Taylor, a river guard, wrote that he, quote, scouted San Antonio Road from 9:30 a.m. till 3 p.m. and apprehended 3 wet feet, who were then delivered to immigration, bathed, and deported. Okay, I don't know if that's like 3 wet feet. I hope that's not like some racist thing. Like, I have no idea what that even means. Maybe I'm not paying attention to something here, but I still don't remember what that like, seriously. Okay, maybe I'm overanalyzing. Okay, the following month, the same guard noted that he reported to the footbridge at 7:10 a.m., left for San Antonio, read 8:40 a.m. with Martin, his co-workers, end quote, and, quote, stopped 3 Mexicans, end quote, who were promptly, quote, vaccinated and given the same preliminary medical inspection, end quote. The journals reveal that up to 20 immigrants at a time were vaccinated by guards on patrol, and in fiscal year 1923, the mounted quarantine guard intercepted and transported to Laredo's international footbridge 1,120 alien Mexicans, in quotes, and along with a handful of Italians, Spaniards, Cubans, Greeks, and other immigrants. After the um, after the creation of the Border Patrol, the mounted quarantine guard was phased out. During its brief existence, however, this unit, like the disinfection process itself, helped to mark Mexicans as outsiders, who could be admitted to the United States only if sanitized by the methods of modern science. The Border Patrol buttressed and intensified the racial dynamics of boundary maintenance, engaged in strategies of bodily pursuit that complemented those of the USPHS. The Border Patrol strove to uphold immigration laws that determined inadmissibility on the basis of national province, physical condition, financial status, moral standing, and occupation, rather than raising an impenetrable shield between the United States and Mexico. However, the Border Patrol functioned as a gatekeeper that allowed or denied entry depending on the country's economic, political, and ideological climate, as well as on patrolmen's personal predilections and local customs. Uh, all right, protecting the American family. Oof. The installation of the Border Patrol at ports stretching from Galveston to Calexico and from Nogales to Los Angeles constituted a continuation of patterns of militarization that dated back to the 17th century, when the Spanish Empire had erected presidios and garrisons along its northern frontier. This spatial configuration, which came to be known as the, quote, line of defense, was part of Spanish attempts to control raids by hostile Indians, and beginning in the late 18th century to offset the increasing encroachment of the French, Anglo-American, and Russian empires into the area and its embryonic trading circuits. Oh, that's gross. Okay. Sounds like slave trading almost. Like sex stewardship. Okay. After Mexico gained its independence in 1821, the region was beset by both legal and illegal Anglo colonizers responding to Mexico's enticing offers of land in return for conversion to Catholicism. Secessionist movements in Texas and U.S. invasion of Mexico in 1846, which sparked the Mexican-American War, unleashed more bellicosity. After the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe and Hidalgo granted the United States most of the present-day Southwest in 1848, militarization was further bolstered by the activists of U.S. cavalry and Army regulars, many posted at old trading forts, who waged guerrilla warfare against Indians. Augmenting this climate were the Mexican rurals, who hunted down Indians and defended the property of rich northern hacendados, as well as border raiders seeking either to extirpate Anglo capitalists and land speculators, or to overthrow the autocratic government of Porfirio Diaz. In 1908, the Bureau of Immigration, the INS precursor, installed its first cadre of mounted inspectors on both the Canadian and Mexican lines, commissioned with debarring primarily Chinese and Southern Europeans. The arrival of these inspectors, many of whom led scene duty in the Spanish-American War, should be seen as an overlapping part of the longer chronology of militarization in the constituted post-colonial space of U.S.-Mexican borderlands. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, both the mounted inspectors and the Texas Rangers monitored the boundary line. Officials formed in 1873, although with roots reaching to the 1830s, the Rangers were a group of Anglo, quote, mobile troubleshooters known for frequently taking the law into their own hands and aggressively pursuing, quote, frontier justice. First formed to run uh, Apaches and Comanches either back into Mexico or into the rapidly expanding reservation system. In the earlier 20th century, the Rangers turned their attention to working class Mexicans and Mexican Americans. As Anglo farmers and merchants gradually gained control of land in Southwest, they shifted their focus from the proposed uh, uh, depredations of hostile Indians to the perceived abuses committed by Mexican outlaws against their private property. From 1915 to 1917, during the height of the Mexican Revolution and the transition to commercialized agriculture, the Rangers were instrumental in the emergence of a new capitalist order and helped incite what scholars have called a, quote, race war in Texas Rio Grande Valley. Damn. And history just repeats itself. Alright, anyways. Hundreds of Mexicans were killed and many protested to Mexican consuls and border cities about the Rangers' brutalities. In the 1910s, both the Rangers and immigrant inspectors were regularly accused of border residents of violence and vigilantism. And the records of the Mexican Secretariat of Foreign Relations, the INS, and the USPHS all contain numerous complaints of mistreatment, especially of women. When the Border Patrol was established, federal officials desired a national and professional police until that would eschew the hooliganism of the Texas Rangers, but be nonetheless capable of officiously control. Added to the Congressional Appropriation Bill that was part of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, the Border Patrol was officially established on May 28, 1924. Its creation was motivated by the same eugenic arguments that pegged the quotas of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act to the 1890 census. Unable to secure a ban on Mexican immigration, Eugenists such as Johnson, Laughlin, and Box essentially comprised with southwestern growers who vehemently opposed the federal interference with their seasonal labor supply. With a starting budget of $1 million with additional land border patrol was, end quote, was formed to defend the, quote, long, wide open stretches an unguarded border between the ports where inadmissible aliens could readily enter the United States, end quote. A year after its formation, the Border Patrol was given the power to arrest, without warrant, any alien suspected of entering the country illegally or violating federal law, and to board and search vessels used to transport aliens or material contraband. In 1924, the Border Patrol was granted an initial force of 472. After nearly doubling to 875 men 5 years later. With the hiring constraints of the Great Depression, the patrol still had fewer than 1,000 employees in 1934. Damn. Alright, I will be back in the next video, guys.